We are in Exodus chapter 12. Finished chapter 12 today. 3 weeks in this chapter. And I'm not apologizing, so there you are. This is one of those chapters that is not only important in the book of Exodus, but is important throughout the entire Old Testament, because it's probably, well, certainly the two most important holidays in Jewish observance would be Passover and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It'd be hard to say which one of those takes precedence, but they both are extraordinarily important. And of course, chapter 12 of Exodus is the chapter where we find the institution of and the general rules applying to the Passover. And we've attempted to emphasize in weeks past that we as Christians see in that a huge significance, because of course our understanding of the Lord's Supper is rooted in that instruction concerning the Passover. And so we read the description of the Passover and we immediately see the way in which it richly informs our understanding of the Lord's Supper and much more than that. So that's where we are. We're going to be picking up at verse 33. We've had the institution of the Passover last week. At the end of our time, we saw the 10th plague, this most catastrophic plague in which the firstborn of Egypt are wiped out, but those who have marked their houses are passed over, hence the term Passover. And to this day, that is a great symbol, a great sign of being protected by the atoning work that God has provided. And the Old Testament provided through shadows in the animal sacrifices, and the New Testament provided definitively, of course, in Christ himself. And as those houses were marked with the sign, we would say, of the cross, so we are marked with the sign of the cross. And God passes over us, and the wrath that would otherwise be our just deserts is diverted to the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world. And so we find great joy and great encouragement in this image we have in the Old Testament of the Passover. So with that, we come to verse 33, and we'll take this paragraph at a time, several short paragraphs, and we'll wrap up the chapter today. So verse 33, chapter 12, the Word of God. The Egyptians urged the people to hasten their departure from the land, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls wrapped up in their cloaks on their shoulders. The Israelites had done as Moses told them. They had asked the Egyptians for jewelry of silver and gold and for clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. And so they plundered the Egyptians. So there's our first short paragraph. Let's ask God's blessing on our consideration of it. Great God in heaven, we are grateful to you for this opportunity once again to gather around this text of Scripture, to be informed as to the great truths of our faith. We pray that the time we have together this morning would be guided through your Spirit, and that you would encourage each of us in our understanding of our faith. We ask these things in the name of Christ. Amen. So the Egyptians urged the people to hasten their departure, fearing we shall all be dead. We have now the final realization of what seemed so unlikely. Just a short time ago, we were wondering if Pharaoh would even permit the people to go, and now we find out, as God himself had predicted and Moses had announced, not only would Pharaoh permit it and the people of God allow it, or the people of Egypt allow it, but in fact it would be insisted upon. You must leave. And so God changes the hearts of these people, obviously using a bit of coercion through the Passover events, and they are hastened in their departure. They seem to have feared that the death of the firstborn was maybe only, step one, and that this plague was going to continue to spread, and that before it was done, maybe everybody in Egypt would be dead, or something like that. That does seem to be their fear. And so they are finally ready not only to permit, but actually to force the Israelites to depart. And that becomes the moment then when the departure actually gets underway. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls wrapped up in their cloaks on their shoulders, kind of wrapping them up in a garment, as it were, to carry them. It's unleavened bread. There hasn't been time for the bread to rise. This is the dough without leaven. This is the historical, then, backdrop to this feast of unleavened bread that goes for 7 days. We saw something of the theological significance of that in the last week or two, in which leaven stands in some sense for wickedness, for evil, for corruption. It has to be gotten rid of. Now we see, in a sense, the historical background that the urgency with which these people are being asked to leave doesn't allow for the normal preparation of the bread for the journey. They just have to grab the unleavened dough. They're going to bake it on the way. It's going to be something like crackers, crunchy, not nice, soft, wonderful bread. It tells them, it reminds them, in a sense, of the urgency with which they had to leave, and it also reminds them theologically and symbolically of the way in which they had to leave behind the leaven, because the leaven stands in some sense for sinfulness, for corruption. They have to travel for several days, eating only this unleavened bread. And so the Feast of Unleavened Bread that comes later in their observance becomes a memory of the fact that they travel for several days eating unleavened bread. And for 7 days now, from this point on, in their national observance, they will just eat unleavened bread. And for several days, they'll be reminded of their journey away from Egypt. If you don't think I'm stretching the point too far, and maybe I am, but, you can let me know. But I think there is in this a sort of practical point that we Christians should always have in our minds, that we are always, in a sense, leaving Egypt behind. We are always chasing out the leaven and heading for a place where God has called us, and that it does involve a certain amount of rigor, a certain amount of severity, a certain amount of self-denial, that we're taking out of our lives those things that may have been comfortable to us, because we're heading for what we know is God's better provision. There is a sense in which, as Christians, we think about this. Every time we survey our lives, we're supposed to be looking for leaven and thinking, how can I now leave the place where I am to some place that's better, that I know God would rather have me there than here. And it may seem like the bread we're eating is a little crunchy in the meantime, It may seem like we're sort of giving up some things that were more or less comfortable to us, enjoyable to us. But the benefits are going to outweigh the costs in the greater scheme of things. I don't know if I'm on real safe ground there, but I think something like that could be construed from this. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, they wrapped it up. This is still commonly done to this day in the Near East, kind of carrying burdens wrapped up in a kind of cloth on their shoulders. The Israelites had done as Moses had told them. They had asked the Egyptians for jewelry of silver and gold and for clothing. We've seen that before. It's already happened. Already the people of God have sought, asked for, and received from their neighbors rich, lavish gifts, clothing, jewelry, and so on. All of this representing compensation for the years of labor that they've provided. Verse 36, the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they let them have what they asked. So, and then this becomes one of the most important lines in the Exodus, and it's repeated throughout the Old Testament. It becomes one of the more or less paradigms by which the Exodus is understood. And so they plundered the Egyptians. They plundered the Egyptians. Now, usually when you hear the word plunder, you think of warfare. Two sides go together, they fight a battle, and in the ordinary course of classical warfare, whoever loses gets plundered. And whoever wins comes off better for the engagement. Plunder is almost universally associated with a war. And the very fact that this term is used in this connection is supposed to say to us that this was a war. There was a battle going on, And in this battle, in this warfare, somebody lost and somebody was plundered and somebody came off better for it, you know. Now, it surprises us to hear that it was a war because we don't see anything about battles. There's no armaments. There's no war horses. There's no, battlefields and conflict and strategies and that sort of thing. But of course, if we know the story, we know that even though a battle was fought, it was fought by the God of Israel fighting on behalf of his firstborn against the gods of the Egyptians, chiefly symbolized in Pharaoh. So it was a battle, but it wasn't a battle that the people of God were actively engaged in. God fought their battle for them, but they got the benefit of the plunder. God went into the battlefield. God was the one who was striking the blow, you see, and defeating the enemies. And God's people now, under his care, received the great benefits of that. And so they plundered the Egyptians. This, of course, again points to the New Testament, doesn't it? You who were in this class last year when we were doing Luke, I hope you remember that we saw again and again this kind of battle motif that came up. So much of what Jesus said and so much of how his trip to Jerusalem was understood was in terms of Jesus going into battle. And there was an idea in which Jesus was going to a place of great conflict. Now, the people who had attached themselves to Jesus thought the battle was going to be a human battle. He was going to go in there and sock it to the Romans and kick them out and, do stuff like that and maybe get rid of the corrupt religious leaders and so on. And so they kind of were ready to buy the popcorn and stuff and sit in the bleachers and watch this battle and see Jesus do this great victory. But they were mistaken in their expectations, but they were not mistaken at the point that Jesus was going into battle. This is how Jesus would qualify himself to be king. Kings earn the right to be kings by being victorious in battle. That's a universal rule, you see, in the ancient world. The dynasty was established originally by winning in battle. Jesus is going into battle, but he's not just going to fight the Romans. He's going to fight a colossally more important enemy than the Romans. He's going to fight that great usurper of authority in this world. He's going to fight the one who sneaked in and illegitimately took control of this world way back in the Garden of Eden. He's going to go in as the second Adam and defeat the king, this satanic king who we succumbed to in the first Adam, and so that's the battle. And as a result of that battle, there is a great exodus. And that, in fact, is the very word that's used in the book of Luke to describe what Christ would do. He would effect an exodus, a freeing of his people from slavery to Satan, from slavery to all that had tied us up all of these years. He's the one who's going to defeat that great illegitimate king and release us to now be his people in this new regime of the kingdom of God. And so, in a sense, the Exodus in the Old Testament is a shadow of this vastly greater Exodus in the New. And in both cases, the battle is fought, but it's not fought by us. We are the rich beneficiaries of the battle, but we're not the ones that actually are out there in the first instance winning that battle. Now, there are battles to be fought. The people of God will fight battles in the wilderness, in the promised land, and so on. We fight battles along the way, but always under the shadow of the fact that the victory has already been won in Christ. And we are already on the winning side, and our confidence can be unlimited in the outcome of these little skirmishes, in which we may find ourselves. So if you're in a skirmish in your life, it's the bottom line, If you're in a skirmish, if there's somebody that's giving you grief, somebody that's misinterpreting, giving you a hard, the battle's won. God says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Overcome evil with good. You can confidently entrust your circumstances into the one who's already won the great victory in history. And of all of this, the Exodus is but a shadow. But we see in it, of course, this much greater theme playing out. So they plundered the Egyptians. They plundered the Egyptians. In church history, that has been a favorite line associated with the sense in which the church has viewed itself as plundering the Egyptians. Augustine, I think, was the first one to use that expression, but it's become a commonplace in history, in church history, of saying that the church becomes the rich beneficiary of the best things produced by the world, you see. We're not above it. And Book of Revelation says, the kings of the earth bring their splendor, bring their glory into it. So the greatest music, the greatest art, the greatest productions, the most beautiful expressions of the human spirit have ultimately become the great heritage of the church, you see. And we enjoy that. We are plundering, in some sense, the Egyptians. Broadly construing that phrase, of course, but it's been somewhat poetically used in church history in that sense. All right, verse 37. The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides the children. I don't know where the women were there, but the men and the children are mentioned. A mixed crowd also went up with them, and livestock in great numbers, both flocks and herds. They baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt. It was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. So this next short paragraph, the Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkoth. So I did bring the map today. You in the first 2 or 3 rows can see it. The rest of you will just have to take it by faith, I imagine, if your eyes are anything like mine. But Ramses is right here. There's a city here called Pithom. All 3 of those are still somewhat debated. There's a fair amount of consensus these days as to the location of these cities that are referred to in Exodus as Pi-Ramses and Pithom. But the problem is they were, as we would infer from the text, mud brick cities. And mud brick doesn't do very well over the centuries, you know. Build things out of stone, they tend to survive. Build things out of mud brick, not so much. And so there's been a huge amount of attempt to try to find these, but unfortunately, there's a fair amount of political resistance. It's one of the strange things about archaeology in Egypt these days, that if people go in for the express purpose of trying to demonstrate the historicity of something like the Exodus, they run into political resistance. Egypt, as you know, is Islamic, and there's a fair amount of hostility to any attempt to verify or vindicate the biblical story of Israel's success. You know enough about the politics of that. I don't have to talk more about it. But there is one site in this region where archaeologists are allowed to excavate for 6 months out of the year. Then they have to take all the dirt and put it back so that it can be farmed the other 6 months of the year. That's the law. So every year archaeologists have to go in, move all that dirt, and try to pick up where they left off. And then 6 months later, they have to bring it all back in, all the backhoes, get it all looking like a nice piece of farmland so it can be farmed. That's the kind of difficulty that is confronted. So that's why there hasn't been as much success or at least progress as we might have thought. But it does seem that this is the general region. This is in the Nile Delta region. And Sukkoth, I'm sure you can't see it unless you're right up here where Kim is. Kim, you see that right there? See that? Sukkoth? There it is. So take it from her. It's right about there. And that is about a 20-mile journey from the nearest city, from Pithom. And it appears that the idea was that this would be the first, in a sense, rendezvous point. The people of Israel, of course, are scattered throughout the Delta region, and some may even be in more of the southern region. We don't know where all they were, but at least some verses imply that there was a fairly widespread population in other quarters. But in any event, it does seem that the idea would be that all of these people would leave and that they would all travel to a known rendezvous point, which is here. Again, that's somewhat speculative, that location, but it's probably pretty close to the mark. And so that's where they go. 600,000 men. That does seem like a huge number. That, of course, would mean that with normal family sizes and so on, we're well upwards toward 2 million or so. Critical scholars say, come on. They roll their eyes. They say, good heavens, you can't believe that. 2 million people, please. Maybe it was about 20,000, and this is sort of editorial exaggeration. And, so you hear that kind of thing. You might allow the possibility of a bit of hyperbole, except for the fact that that number is repeated several times in the Old Testament, in different contexts for different purposes. The first chapter of Numbers goes back and with a very arithmetic kind of focus gives us the number of 625,000 or something like that, a rather precise number. And so I don't think you can so easily dismiss this as a sort of exaggeration or figure of speech or hyperbole or something like that. The text itself wants to say to us it was a huge crowd. And it would, in fact, I suppose, almost border on the miraculous to say that that many people in one night could rise up and sort of move out and have this great consolidated beginning of the Exodus take place. But at least the commentators I've read who are sympathetic to it say, things like this have happened. That sometimes under great psychological pressure or rising to a great occasion, you've seen remarkable, striking, stunning occasions where a massive number of people have in a coordinated way done some remarkable thing. And so they say this is not without precedent. It's not just out of hand, preposterous. And for my part, I'm going to go ahead and stay with take seriously the numbers here. So we'll assume that this is upwards of a couple of million people who are now on foot, women and children, not going that far, 20 miles, of course. After about a day or so, they could get there, depending on the amount of distance they have to cover. But certainly the 20 miles would be feasible within a day or so. So we have this group. Then we have reference next in verse 38 to a mixed crowd. Also went up with them, and livestock in great numbers, both flocks and herds. This mixed crowd, as you know, is also called sometimes the mixed multitude, and in Numbers they are somewhat impolitely called the rabble. Not a great term, the rabble. That sounds a little bit harsh, but of course they're called the rabble not so much because they are outsiders to the community of Israel, but because they are grumbling and complaining, and they're the first ones who are beginning to whine about circumstances, and it's their bad attitude that tends to begin infecting the rest of the people of God. So I think the rabble is more of a commentary on their character than on simply their status within the community. But this is the first mention of them, so we need to think about them for a minute. This is something of a bandwagon effect. I think y'all understand that. Here's a great, wonderful liberation of a slave population. And if you happen to be a slave in Egypt at that time, even if you're not an Israelite slave, it looks like a big opportunity, And so I'm sure there was a goodly number. I don't know what number. It appears to be a number on top of the 2 million. So we'll kind of assume that at least for the time being, who jump on the bandwagon. God has done great things for his people, and these folks who are outsiders are thinking, cool. And so they're going to jump on and get the benefit of this, and away they go. The church has always had to wrestle with this issue. There are times in the church's history when the church has been beleaguered, embattled, put, on the ropes a little bit, and usually it's not real popular in those days to jump on the church bandwagon. You don't find, but there are other times in church history when the church has been very richly blessed or has political favor. And then the church always has to deal with the question, how about all these other folks that want to jump on board? What do you do with them? And this is kind of the first time that we find that problem being addressed, and it's addressed in some detail in this text we'll see before we're done. In church history, we see many occasions where this has popped up. After Constantine legitimized Christianity in the Roman Empire, after a few years, there was actually a law that was passed that said, if you are a slave in the Roman world and you convert to the Christian faith, you are immediately emancipated. How many people do you thought, this Christian thing's not so bad? They start kind of thinking, that's not a bad way to go. And there was a huge number of people, slaves, who thought, what's wrong with that? They give up their idolatry, they go to the church, they get baptized, they confess Christ, they're liberated the same day, they're emancipated. Now we of course look back and we can feel a little bit cynical about that and think, these people couldn't have been truly converted. But there's actually historical testimony that some of them were. That some of them, though they went to the church for purely selfish reasons, came out the other end truly soundly converted. Not all of them, to be sure. But God has his ways, I'm sure some of this mixed multitude that joined the Israelites turned out, before it was all over, being truly possessed of faith. I don't think it matters a whole lot why you come to church. Some people think, well, you really need to come with a pure heart. I don't think so. I just rather you just come for any reason. Even though, it's better to go to church for a bad reason than to stay away for a good reason. It really is. It's better to be in church. So, people come to church for a whole lot of lousy reasons. I say, God bless them. Open the doors, let them come in. And that does seem to be the spirit of the thing. And later in church history, there was the Frankish king Clovis, first king to unite the Franks, and he had a wonderful evangelistic method. He liked to go out and conquer. He was good at that, and so he'd conquer villages, and then he'd say, "How would you like folks to become Christians?" And if they became Christians, fine. If not, they were executed. So there were tons of converts. People just flooded into the church. What are you going to do? And all through church history, we find that kind of thing, and certainly even up to this time. I've been here at First Presbyterian for some 30 years at least, a little more than that actually. And over the years, I've, of course, as all of you have, met people. I've known people that came to this church, joined the church, stood up front, confessed their faith, and yet somehow in my mind, I thought, the only reason that person's here is because it's good for business. And it is good for business. It has been good for some people's business to be a member of First Presbyterian Church. Do you know that? Now, that's not the best reason to be here. And if a person is going to First Presbyterian Church just because it's good for business, we can say on the one hand, God bless you, and on the other hand, you're still going to hell. Because being a member of First Presbyterian Church will count for 0 on Judgment Day. 0. But I'd still rather have them be here under the preaching of the gospel, under the hearing of the word, because who knows but what God's Spirit may reach that heart and change it. And that has, I think, happened occasionally. Sometimes it's not so good for business, but often it is. Some of you may know the story of Karl Marx, whose father, Karl Marx, of course, was Jewish, strong Jewish family. Dad moves the family to a new community, and in that community, the predominant religious kind of culture there was Lutheran. Dad looks at the shape of things, decides, I think I'll become a Lutheran. He does. It's when Karl Marx is about 15 years old. That kind of casual conversion of the father of Karl Marx to Lutheranism, many people trace the atheism of Karl Marx to that very moment. That's when the cynicism that drove him so deeply, not only in his politics but in his theology, may have started. So it doesn't always have a good outcome. Sometimes it can be not such a happy ending. But in any event, it's an issue that has to be dealt with. And here we find the mixed multitude jumps on board. They baked unleavened cakes of dough that they had brought out of Egypt. It was not leavened because they'd been driven out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. And that's just a revisiting of the theme that we talked about before. No time for the bread to rise. So it's unleavened bread giving rise to a feast of unleavened bread that reminds them of putting away the leaven in their lives. The symbolism then becomes a symbol of leaving behind the comforts, the unhealthy comforts of Egypt, to go to a place that is better, albeit more rigorous. Now, the next two verses are two I'd like to just skip, and as soon as I read them, you'll know why. I've been kind of dreading them now for a long time, but here they come. The time that the Israelites had lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the companies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. That was for the Lord a night of vigil to bring them out of the land of Egypt. That same night is a vigil to be kept for the Lord by all the Israelites throughout their generations. Now, some of you are thinking, I just got torpedoed big time, aren't you? Because I've been laboring the point several weeks in a row that the children of Israel were actually in Egypt about 215 years. And that the slavery status in Egypt was only about 100 years. Y'all remember that? And now, bang, look at that. The Bible just, seems to say something else here. This is the single most problematic verse, for obvious reasons, with my hypothesis. I'm not going to labor this again, and if you want to ask about it, I'd be glad to go into more detail. But let me give you the really quick response to this. As I've told you before, and by the way, footnote, pause button, if how many years Israel spent in Egypt is not a burning issue to you, like you're saying, you just have to work with me here, because I'm a little bit OCD about these things, and I can't quite just say, oh, no big deal. So anyway, if you're interested, if you have ears to hear, fine, and if you want to sleep for about 3 minutes, that's fine too. I'll wake you up when we're done. But anyway, the view that the people of Israel were only in Egypt for about 215 years has been virtually the universal view in Jewish understanding, notwithstanding this text. And the reason for that, there's several reasons. The genealogies of the Old Testament, the chronology, otherwise, it just doesn't work. There's no way to make it work if the people of Israel were actually in Egypt for 430 years. So if you look at Jewish commentators, they don't have any vested interest here besides just trying to, in an objective way, construe the text. That has been virtually taken for granted. All the Talmudic writers and so on, Josephus simply states it. It was 215 years. The Septuagint version of the Old Testament, the official Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, translated about 200 years BC, actually translates this verse this way. The time that the Israelites had lived in Egypt and Canaan was 430 years. That's simply there, stated in the Septuagint version. That's how commonly accepted it was. The Apostle Paul himself clearly makes it 430 years from Abraham to the Exodus, So, right or wrong, that has been this vast majority view in Jewish comment. It's also been the classical Christian approach. You can read John Calvin's commentary on Exodus. He simply says the children of Israel were in Egypt for 215 years. He takes that number as well. Now, you might ask, well, then how come it says they were in Egypt for 430? Why does this text seem to be such a glaring inconsistency with that? And while there's a variety of explanations, I think at least one that may or may not, be correct, but at least I'll float this and give you some food for thought here, is that at the time that God made promises to Abraham, which should be the beginning of that 430 years, at that time, Egypt had what's called a hegemony in Canaan that covered quite a bit of it. That is, Egypt extended its authority well into parts of the southern region, what's called Kole Syria, or the southern region of Canaan. They actually controlled it, and it was considered sort of an adjunct territory to Egypt. And thus, Abraham, who did move south just after the promises given in Genesis 15, would technically be in Egypt for that 430 years. That's just one of several kind of collateral circumstantial explanations that are provided to account for this verse. I realize it's not, probably a big deal, but it has been a bit of a controversy, and I'm still going to stick with my, position that I've argued earlier. I won't die on that hill, really. There's more important things in heaven and earth than this, but just if you're curious, that's been a way that's been handled. All right, this was for the Lord a night of vigil to bring them out of the land of Egypt. That same night is a vigil to be kept for the Lord. Oh, by the way, wake up. That same night is a vigil to be kept by the Lord, by all the Israelites throughout their generations. All right. This last paragraph is here because of the allusion earlier to the mixed multitude. It becomes one of the most really important and in some ways surprising texts in all the Old Testament. It seems to be there because we need some explanation as to how the mixed multitude is going to be handled by the people of God. These are not Israelites. They have not, to our knowledge, in any sense along the way, embraced the religion of Israel. They're simply grabbing on to the moment and escaping along with the people of God. So what are we going to do with them? This paragraph seems to be intended to address that, at least to some degree. So listen to it, verse 43. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance for the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but any slave who has been purchased may eat of it after he has been circumcised. No bound or hired servant may eat of it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the animal outside the house, and you shall not break any of its bones. The whole congregation of Israel shall celebrate it. If an alien who resides with you wants to celebrate the Passover to the Lord, all his males shall be circumcised. Then he may draw near to celebrate it. He shall be regarded as a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. There shall be one law for the native and for the alien who resides among you." There is probably no more radical text in all of ancient literature, especially if this actually dates back to the era in which it purports to be written, that is more progressive than this text on the issue of how outsiders are to be handled in a given community. And this has become one of the most important comments on that topic, and it addresses directly this issue of the mixed multitude that came. So, what does it say? The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance for the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it." So the first thing we hear is an exclusivity principle. That a person cannot just casually and sort of indifferently participate in the Passover meal. From a Christian point of view in the New Testament, we would say the same thing about the Lord's Supper. We don't just want people to casually take the Lord's Supper. We think there is a peril in doing that. Paul talks about the risks of taking the Lord's Supper, not discerning the Lord's body, and taking it in a sort of cavalier, indifferent, or unworthy manner. So there is, in the first instance, a principle of exclusion. You have to, in some sense, be an insider to take the sacrament. That would be the basic rule. But what does it take to become an insider? Well, verse 44 starts answering that question. Any slave, and of course it's interesting that that example would be chosen, because that would be the person you would think least likely to have any access to the high and holy sacramental meal. Any slave who's been purchased may eat of it if he's been circumcised. Now this becomes one of the most astonishing elevations of those people who in the ancient world were considered barely human. Now, of course, some of us with our modern sensibilities think, well, the Old Testament should have just condemned slavery outright. Well, it doesn't work that way, and you don't have that kind of attempt to just jettison established, almost universally practiced human institutions. There's no great blessing on slavery. It's not endorsed as such. It is heavily regulated, as you know, in Israel. But the point that's striking here is that even if a person is a slave, that person is nevertheless warranted and indeed commanded to sit at the same table. This is one great moment when a slave status ceases to be of any relevance. And everybody at that table is sharing with a kind of equal dignity in that holy meal. And a person is not disqualified simply because they are in this most demeaning status otherwise. It's a great elevation. And you can see already the seeds of the destruction of a notion of human property is already present here. We saw something very much like that in the history of the church, where slaves tended to be the earlier converts. Many times masters were converted based on the testimony of their slaves. This would be in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries. Masters would go to church and find that their slave was an elder in the church. And in the church, they were under the authority of the person that was otherwise their slave at home. And that began to unravel the institution of slavery pretty profoundly, as the absurdity of the whole idea became more and more, conspicuous to the Christian conscience. And eventually, under the influence of the Christian faith, slavery was outlawed. Took a while, but nevertheless, it was not anything but the Christian effect that had that sort of influence there. Same idea here. Then it says, no bound or hired servant may eat of it. Unfortunately, the translation doesn't help us much. Both of those words, bound, which is the sense of that word would be an indentured servant, that is a temporary servant or temporary slave, or hired servant, and that word is also rendered sojourner, and your text, your translations may actually use some of that language, shall eat of it. The point here is people who are only here temporarily. They're just passing through. They're just, they've indentured themselves to do 5 years of service, then they're going to be on their way. There's no commitment of a permanent character to the community. They may not eat of it. This is not something for those who are just dropping by. Your neighbor, the Hittite, comes by for coffee and a Danish. And you happen to be doing the Passover that night. He's not invited because the presumption is that he's not joining up. He's just there on a kind of temporary provisional basis. Well, that would be the sort of notion here. It shall be eaten in one house. That's powerful. You're not going to have all the special people eating in one house and the others eating in the shack that's out back, you see. One house, one table, an equivalence of the people who come to it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the animal outside the house. We're not going to parcel up this animal and have the haves and the have-nots, or some having a better portion than others, or anything like that. You will not break any of its bones. The whole force of that is that there is one sacrifice and everybody participates in it. This is really heavily behind Paul's censure of the Corinthians when he talks about them doing the very thing that is being condemned here, you recall, where some people eat and some people go hungry, and all of that problem they had in the Corinthian church was really violating a principle that was already found in the Passover observance. The whole congregation of Israel shall celebrate it. It extends to everybody. Nobody is exempted. This is a universal celebration of the people of God. If an alien who resides with you, one of these mixed multitude, who resides with you, wants to celebrate the Passover to the Lord, all his males shall be circumcised, then he may draw near to celebrate it. He shall be regarded, this is astonishing, as a native of the land. Here you have the great anti-racist principle of the Old Testament. I'm not saying the Jewish people were always able to avoid racism, but as are we not able to as well in many cases. But the point is, the official policy of the Old Testament was not in any sense racist. Anybody could come, any skin color, any ethnicity, any whatever, if they wanted to participate. And they were willing to take the mark upon themselves of membership in this community and otherwise take to themselves, as it were, the ethical standards of the community, then they would be regarded not simply as barely members, second-class citizens. They were going to be regarded as if they'd been born there. They could intermarry, they could join in, they could become what was, in a sense, Israel's melting pot. And they could become part of that community as they agreed to submit in that way. We would say something like that as Christians. If a person wants to take the Lord's Supper, we think that's wonderful. They need to be baptized. They need to make a public profession of faith. They need to declare that indeed they are followers of Christ. And on the basis of that public profession, and on the basis of their baptism, and on the basis of, the church has classically said, that they're not living in some sort of open, notorious, hostile relationship to the Christian ethic, on the basis of all of that, they are accepted as if they'd been born in the community. And that is, you'd really look in vain for anything like this. Among the laws of the Spartans, even Lycurgus, who's the great lawgiver of the Spartans, has nothing like this. Solon of the Athenians, these great kind of enlightened spirits of the ancient world, nothing like this. This is so progressive in a good sense of that term that you just find it almost unprecedented, certainly in this time frame in history. There shall be one law for the native and for the alien who resides among you. This is what lawyers would call equal protection under the law. There's going to be one law for everybody. There's not some people that have a superior status. Lady Justice is blindfolded in America, but way before that in Israel, you see. And so there's one law out there, and everybody enjoys the privileges and protections of that law. The church has always had to kind of walk a fine line on the question of how you deal with folks who want to join the church. To what degree do they need to prove their faith? And there's been kind of a sort of a peril on both sides. Sometimes churches get too exacting, too much of a purist mentality. They want to put people through the meat grinder, put them through all kinds of microscopic examination of the inner, workings of their soul to make sure they're really regenerate. And that goes a little too far in one direction. That doesn't seem to be the spirit of the New Testament. On the other hand, sometimes the church becomes so lax that there's no standard at all, that there's just kind of a wide open sort of latitude about this whole business of being a member of the church, where there's really no standard to speak of at all. The bar disappears. Somewhere in the middle, the church finds this balance. And the balance has tended to be, historically, you're baptized, you make a public profession of your faith, either at your baptism if you're an adult, or at your confirmation if you were baptized as an infant, and your life is publicly not blameworthy. There's not a sense in which the church is on a witch hunt, looking for tiny little problems, examining you, watching you, little details in your life. The question is, are you in your public demeanor living in a way that is fundamentally consistent with the standards that Christ has laid out for us? And that you're not a drug dealer, for example. Now, I don't know how much the church enforces that principle even that much these days, but nevertheless, that's traditionally been the way it's been viewed. The parable in the New Testament that we've seen as being the most helpful on this is Jesus' parable of the, what is it? The parable of the, it's usually called the parable of the tares. Remember that? There's a landowner, he plants seed in his field. Overnight, some bad person comes in and plants a weed that was called tares. And there was a species of weeds at that time that in the early growth of that plant looked just like wheat. It was almost impossible to distinguish. If you were a trained expert, you could make a distinction, but the ordinary person couldn't. The question is raised, what are we going to do? Shall we go try to root out those tares? And the landowner's response, speaking of course, in a sense for Christ himself, the counsel of the church is what? Let them both grow together, Wait until the harvest, exactly. At that time it becomes obvious. And that's kind of where the church has had to be. We don't want to become so super exacting that we might root out some of the good wheat in our desire to have a perfectly pure church. We're willing to grant the church is not pure. It's a mixed multitude. We believe the church will have within it people of true faith. We just allow, as a general, reality, that there will always be people in the church who are externally Christian, to be sure, but whose hearts may not truly be in it. And all of that philosophy seems to have its origins, really, in this text. And that finishes chapter 12.